The announcement came at 11:47 p.m. EST on January 17th, buried in a Truth Social post between complaints about media coverage and praise for dairy farmers. 23 words that would fracture the Western alliance and send silver markets into chaos. Effective February 1st, 10% additional tariffs on all goods from Denmark, Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, UK, Netherlands, Finland. No warning, no negotiation, no escape clause. By the time European markets opened 8 hours later, the economic order that had governed transatlantic relations for decades was already dead. The first casualty wasn't diplomatic protocol or trade agreements, it was trust. Within minutes of the post going live, emergency conference calls were lighting up government buildings from Copenhagen to Berlin. Finance ministers were dragged from their beds. Central bank governors canceled weekend plans. But the real panic was happening in places the public never sees. The commodity trading floors where silver futures are bought and sold in million-ounce lots. Because this wasn't really about tariffs. It was about control. Control of an island that sits on top of what geologists now estimate to be the world's largest untapped silver reserves. Control of the supply chains that keep Europe's industrial base functioning. Control of the metal that makes artificial intelligence possible. The 10% tariff was just the opening move in a game where the stakes were measured in the trillions of dollars and the future of technological civilization. The official justification came 12 hours later, delivered by White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt, with the kind of practiced indifference that signals a prepared strategy rather than an impulsive response. For too long, the United States has subsidized European defense while European nations profit from American protection. The deployment of military forces to Greenland represents an unacceptable escalation against a peaceful American initiative. The words were carefully chosen. No mention of sovereignty, no acknowledgement of Danish territorial claims, just the cold language of economic warfare. What Leavitt didn't mention was the classified intelligence briefing that had landed on President Trump's desk 48 hours earlier. Satellite imagery showing Swedish troops disembarking in Nuuk. German reconnaissance teams establishing positions near known silver deposits. French military engineers surveying transport routes from mine sites to deepwater ports. The Europeans weren't just defending Denmark's territorial integrity. They were protecting their access to resources that could determine the balance of power for the next century. The intelligence came from multiple sources, but the most damning evidence was electronic intercepts of communications between European defense ministers. Transcripts showed explicit discussions about securing mineral extraction rights and maintaining strategic resource access. One particularly revealing exchange between French and German officials referenced the necessity of preventing American monopolization of Arctic silver reserves. The language was diplomatic, but the intent was unmistakable. The European response was swift and coordinated in a way that suggested extensive preparation. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen called an emergency meeting for 6 a.m. Brussels time. By noon, a joint statement had been drafted and approved by all 27 member states. The European Union stands in full solidarity with Denmark and the people of Greenland. Any attempt to coerce sovereign nations through economic pressure represents a fundamental violation of international law and democratic principles. But behind the diplomatic language, panic was spreading through European industrial circles. Silver-dependent industries began calculating the cost of disrupted supply chains. Solar panel manufacturers faced the prospect of silver imports becoming prohibitively expensive. Electronics companies watched their stock prices collapse as investors realized the implications. The automotive sector, already struggling with electric vehicle transitions that required massive silver inputs, faced an existential crisis. The numbers were staggering. Europe imported 180 million ounces of silver annually from North American sources. A 10% tariff would add $1.8 billion to industrial costs if silver prices remained stable at $100 per ounce. But prices wouldn't remain stable. They never did when supply chains faced political disruption. The futures markets were already pricing in scenarios where silver could reach $150 per ounce by summer. Goldman Sachs released an emergency analysis projecting that the tariffs would increase European manufacturing costs by 12% across silver-intensive industries. For companies like ASML, whose advanced chip-making equipment required precise silver components, the impact would be even more severe. The Dutch company's stock price fell 18% in after-hours trading as investors recognized that American tariffs could cripple Europe's most advanced technology sector. The Swiss were the first to break ranks. At 2 p.m. Zurich time, the Swiss National Bank announced it would begin strategic accumulation of physical silver to protect against supply disruptions. The announcement was couched in technical language about monetary stability and commodity reserve diversification, but the message was clear. Even neutral Switzerland recognized that silver had become a weapon in economic warfare. The British response was more subtle, but equally significant. Chancellor Rachel Reeves held a closed-door meeting with representatives from Johnson Matthey, the world's largest silver refinery. Within hours, the company announced it would increase processing capacity by 40% and establish emergency stockpiles of refined silver. The timing wasn't coincidental. London was positioning itself as Europe's silver hub, calculating that American tariffs would create arbitrage opportunities for British intermediaries. Meanwhile, the Germans were taking a different approach. Volkswagen and BMW jointly announced a $3 billion initiative to develop alternative materials for electric vehicle production. The goal was explicit: reduce dependence on silver-intensive technologies before tariffs made them economically unviable. It was the admission of defeat disguised as innovation. Europe's largest automakers were publicly acknowledging that American economic pressure could force fundamental changes in their production processes. The French reaction was characteristically dramatic. President Emmanuel Macron called the tariffs an act of economic aggression against the European project. But behind the rhetoric, French industrial policy was shifting rapidly. Total Energies announced it would accelerate development of North African silver mining projects. The goal was to create supply chains that bypassed American influence entirely. It was economic nationalism masquerading as diversification. The real drama was unfolding in the silver markets themselves. The London Bullion Market Association reported that physical silver premiums had jumped to 35% above spot prices within hours of the tariff announcement. European industrial buyers were competing desperately for available inventory. Refineries in Switzerland and Germany reported order backlogs extending into 2027. The just-in-time supply chains that had made global manufacturing efficient were proving catastrophically vulnerable to political disruption. But the most significant development was happening quietly in the offices of sovereign wealth funds and central banks. Norway's government pension fund, the world's largest sovereign wealth fund, began liquidating bond holdings to purchase physical silver. The Bank of Finland announced it would add silver to its reserve portfolio for the first time since 1971. Sweden's Riksbank authorized emergency silver purchases to support domestic industry. Central banks that had spent decades focused on gold were rediscovering silver's strategic importance. The cascade effects were becoming visible across multiple sectors simultaneously. Siemens announced that delivery times for industrial automation equipment would extend by 6 months due to silver supply constraints. Ericsson warned that 5G infrastructure deployment would slow significantly. Even luxury watchmakers like Rolex and Omega faced disruptions as silver components became scarce and expensive. The Danish response was particularly revealing. Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen held an emergency session of Parliament to authorize increased defense spending focused specifically on Arctic capabilities. The budget included provisions for strategic mineral security and critical resource protection. The language was careful, but the intent was clear. Denmark was preparing for a long struggle over Greenland's resources. European intelligence agencies began reporting unusual activity in silver trading patterns. Chinese state-owned enterprises were quietly purchasing European silver inventory, apparently calculating that disrupted Western supply chains created opportunities for Beijing. Russian oligarchs, despite sanctions, were using shell companies to accumulate silver positions. The tariff announcement had created a global scramble for silver inventory that extended far beyond Europe and America. The technology sector faced the most immediate crisis. TSMC, while based in Taiwan, had significant European operations that depended on American silver imports. The company announced it would need to restructure supply arrangements to maintain production schedules. Samsung's European facilities reported similar challenges. The global semiconductor industry was discovering that political tensions between America and Europe could paralyze chip production worldwide. Energy companies were equally vulnerable. Solar panel production required substantial silver inputs, and European manufacturers like Meyer Burger faced impossible calculations. Continue production with expensive American silver, or shut down operations until alternative supplies could be secured. The European green energy transition, already struggling with Chinese competition, now faced American economic pressure as well. The automotive industry's response was swift and desperate. Mercedes-Benz announced it would reduce silver content in new models by 60% within 18 months. The changes would affect everything from electrical systems to battery management. Performance would suffer, but the alternative was production lines grinding to a halt. It was engineering compromise forced by political reality. European banks began modeling worst-case scenarios where silver prices reached $300 per ounce. At those levels, entire industries would become economically unviable. Solar energy would cost more than fossil fuels. Electric vehicles would become luxury items. The digital transformation that had driven European competitiveness would reverse itself as companies reverted to older, less silver-intensive technologies. The insurance industry was the next domino to fall. Lloyd's of London announced it would no longer underwrite policies covering silver supply chain disruptions. The risk had become too great and too unpredictable. European manufacturers found themselves facing not just higher costs, but complete inability to hedge against supply failures. The business model of just-in-time manufacturing was collapsing in real time. American markets were experiencing their own turmoil, but in the opposite direction. Silver mining companies saw their valuations soar. Hecla Mining gained 45% in 2 trading sessions. First Majestic Silver approached all-time highs. Even marginal operations like Alexco Resource became attractive as investors bet on sustained high prices and constrained European competition. The geopolitical implications were becoming clearer by the hour. NATO officials held emergency consultations to address what one diplomat called the first trade war within the alliance. Article 5 covered military attacks, but no one had anticipated economic warfare between alliance members. The legal framework that had governed Western cooperation for 7 decades was proving inadequate to address resource-based conflicts. European military officials were privately expressing concerns that went far beyond economics. Silver was essential for military electronics, satellite communications, and advanced weapons systems. If American tariffs disrupted silver supplies, European defense capabilities could be compromised. The alliance created to contain Soviet power was being fractured by competition for resources needed to maintain technological superiority. The timing of the crisis was particularly damaging for European unity. The continent was already struggling with energy security following the Ukraine conflict. Now silver security was adding another layer of vulnerability. Member states began calculating whether their national interests required independent action rather than collective response. The European project faced pressure from both external coercion and internal competition. Russia and China watched these developments with obvious satisfaction. Both countries had spent years trying to fracture Western unity through military pressure and economic inducement. Now America was accomplishing their goals through its own policies. The multipolar world that Moscow and Beijing had long advocated was emerging not through their strength, but through Western self-destruction. The silver futures markets reflected this new reality with brutal clarity. Contracts for European delivery were trading at substantial premiums to American delivery. The global price had fragmented along political lines. Arbitrage opportunities existed, but only for traders willing to navigate complex regulatory restrictions and political risks. The efficient market that had governed silver trading for decades was being replaced by a maze of bilateral arrangements and strategic calculations. Industrial companies began announcing force majeure clauses to escape contracts they could no longer fulfill. Electronics manufacturers couldn't guarantee delivery dates. Solar installers couldn't quote firm prices. The uncertainty was more damaging than the tariffs themselves. Business requires predictability to function, and predictability was the first casualty of economic nationalism. European retailers faced immediate pressure as consumers began hoarding silver-containing products. Jewelry stores reported buying sprees as customers calculated that prices would only rise. Electronics retailers struggled to maintain inventory as distributors prioritized industrial customers over retail ones. The consumer economy was discovering its dependence on industrial supply chains that most people never considered. The diplomatic efforts to resolve the crisis were complicated by the fact that positions had hardened before negotiations could begin. America demanded European recognition of its Greenland initiative. Europe insisted on territorial integrity and international law. Neither side could compromise without appearing weak to domestic constituencies. The tariffs had created political dynamics that made resolution more difficult rather than easier. Central bank interventions were proving ineffective against market forces. The European Central Bank's attempts to stabilize currency markets were overwhelmed by private sector silver buying. The Swiss National Bank's silver purchases were driving prices higher rather than stabilizing them. Monetary policy tools designed for conventional economic cycles were inadequate for resource wars. The physical silver market was experiencing unprecedented stress. Refineries reported that institutional buyers were requesting delivery of actual metal rather than paper contracts. Vault storage facilities in London and Zurich were approaching capacity constraints. Transportation companies struggled to manage increased demand for armored vehicles and secure storage. The infrastructure of silver trading was buckling under political pressure. Smart money was already positioning for the next phase of the crisis. Private equity firms were acquiring silver mines regardless of immediate profitability. Hedge funds were building positions based not on current supply and demand, but on geopolitical scenarios extending years into the future. The investment community was pricing in a world where silver access would be determined by political alignment rather than economic efficiency. Technology companies were beginning to redesign products around silver constraints that might persist indefinitely. Apple was reportedly developing electronics that used 50% less silver. Tesla was engineering battery systems that eliminated silver entirely. Innovation was being driven not by performance improvements or cost reductions, but by resource availability. The tariffs were forcing technological regression in the name of political independence. As February 1st approached, the deadline for tariff implementation, neither side showed signs of backing down. European military deployments to Greenland continued despite American warnings. American silver mining companies increased production in anticipation of sustained high prices. The crisis had developed its own momentum that seemed independent of the political decisions that had created it. The silver market was no longer responding to normal economic forces. Supply and demand curves had been replaced by political calculations and strategic positioning. Price discovery was happening not in trading pits or electronic exchanges, but in government offices where officials weighed resource security against diplomatic relationships. The situation had reached what military strategists call a point of no return, a condition where escalation becomes inevitable regardless of the consequences. Both sides had committed too much political capital to retreat. The economics of silver had become secondary to the politics of power, and in that transformation, the global economy was discovering that the age of resource abundance might have been an historical anomaly rather than a permanent condition. The tariffs would take effect in 14 days, but their real impact had already begun. Trust had been broken. Supply chains had been fractured. Markets had been weaponized. The question was no longer whether Europe and America could resolve their differences over Greenland. The question was whether Western civilization could survive the resource wars it had inadvertently created.